In the context of our Siyum for Masechet Eruvin, as we said earlier this evening, we want to study the beginning of the 8th parak, Parak Ketzad Mishtat. And the discussion here revolves and addresses the case of a Rishus Shlishis. So you have Ruvain's Rishus, you have Shimon's Rishus, and you have a third Rishus. That third Rishus might be accessible to both Ruvain and Shimon, but is it on an equal level, or perhaps it's more noach tashmishto, it's more accessible and usable for one of the two, either for Ruvain or for Shimon? So, for example, we could talk about a tel or an amud, which is discussed in the previous shir, that is situated between the Bnei Hamir Peses and the Bnei Achotz on the bottom. And is it more noach for one than the other? Which establishes that if it's above 10 tvachim, it reaches within the sphere of the Mirpeses. They now have rishus and leniency. They're permitted to use this amud or tel or sela, chuyas abar, and the other members of the chotzer on the bottom, on the ground floor, they don't have such access. But if it's less than 10 tvachim, then they have more access. So if you take a look at the Gemara here, right here on Pei Gimel and base following the Mishnah, the Gemara establishes Pshita, Lazebe Pesach v'Lazebe Pesach, which means that both Chatzeros have equal and easy access to this third Rishus, Hainu Chalon Shebein Shtei Chatzeros, which means that just like we said, if there's a window between two Chatzeros, which is mentioned back in the beginning of the previous Parak Chalon and Ayin Vav, you need an error between the two Chatzeros because the two Chatzeros merge into one via this Chalon that has certain proportions and so forth. So too, by analogy, if this Amud is accessible to two Rishuyos, then Osro Zu al Zu, and we need an Erev Chatzeros. Lazeb is Rika v'Lazeb is Rika. What happens if we have a third Rishus located between two Chatzeros, and it's not such easy access? Why? Because that it requires Rika. You have an Amud that's very tall, it's 10 Tvachim high, and either the Bnei Chatzeros on this side or that side, in order to enjoy the benefit of the top of the Amud, they will have to throw something that's Bizrika. And once again, there's no preference of one chutz or the other. They have an equal hassle, we'll call it, of zrika if they want to use the top of the kos or the Then we have lazebet shilshul v'lazebet shilshul. What happens if you have a third rishus that's lower than the two chatzeros, the two rishuyos? They both need shilshul, which means they both have to throw it down. It's an uncomfortable kind of use. But the bottom line is they're equal, and it has the same status as Lazebe Pesach, Lazebe Pesach, Lazebe Zrika, Lazebe Zrika. They're all equal. And Osra Zu al Zu, they have the same heavy requirement or tircha in order to use this area that's below Shilshul and so forth. And therefore, we need an Erev Chatzeros. What happens, Lazebe Pesach, Lazebe Zrika? Let's say that one chutz is higher than the other chutz. The accessibility, because of the height of the amud of 10 tfachim, is greater, and it's easily used by the top chutzer and not the bottom chutzer. The bottom chutzer is going to need to do a zrika to throw it upwards from the bottom. Hainu de Rabba bar Rav Huna Rav Nachman, and in this case, we're going to give the use and permit the use of this amud to that chotzer that's on the same level as the amud, the higher chotzer. Lazebe Pesach v'lazebe shilshul. Here we have a use of, let's say, a bar or something lower down, or perhaps the chatzeros are higher up. And for one chotzer, it's a Pesach. All they need is to just stretch their arm out and they can enjoy the tail. It's 10 tefachim high. But for the other chutzah, because the other chutzah is even higher up on the second floor, they need to throw it down. So then, Hainu, the Rav Shizbi, Omer Rav Nachman, all this is the sugich back on Daf Ayin Zayin, and we dedicate and we single out that tail for the benefit of the Pesach, meaning that chotzer that is not so high up and has easy access. But what happens in the case of lazeh b'shilshul, the lazeh b'zrika? The Gemara vacillates about the question of one chotzer that's higher than the tail, one chotzer that's lower than the tail. And in both cases, there's a distance of 10 tfachim. So the higher chotzer has to throw it down 10 tfachim, that's called shilchul. The lower chotzer has to throw it up 10 tfachim, and that's called zrika. Here we have a machlokas amoroim between Rav and Shmuel. Rav, Omar Rav, Shnei Masura. Rav seems to say that we don't differentiate between shilchul and zrika. We're not going to weigh them and measure if one is more comfortable. It's easier to throw down. It's easier to throw up, whatever it is. They're all equal shava v'shava. It goes back to the case of Pesach Lazeh, etc., etc. And Otzrim Zualzu, we must have an Eruv. Shmuel Amar Nosino Sol Lazeh b'shilshul. It's a lot more comfortable and it's a lot easier to throw something down. And therefore, Shalazeh, the shilshul, the one who has a chotzer that's higher up and he's throwing down, Tashmisho benachas, but Lazeh, the person who's on the lower chotzer and he has to throw it up, Tashmisho bekosha. That's considered a difficult throw, a difficult use. It's not a noach tashmisho, it's not an easy and comfortable way of using it. And therefore, we're going to apportion and dedicate this area, this chotzer ashli, this rishus ashlishis, to the person who's up on top, and all he needs is shilshul to use this rishus ashlishis. And now Shmuel formulates a klal. Klal shekol dover shesh tashmisho lazeh benachas v'lazeh bekosher nosino so lazeh shetashmisho benachas. If it's difficult for one relative, the other one is easy, it's more noach, it's more accessible, usable, etc., then we give permission to the one who has tashmisho benachas. Again, even though it's not really tashmisho benachas in this case, it's shilshul, and shilshul is still tashmisho kosher, but relative to the guy who is on the bottom and has to throw it up with a zrika, shilshul is considered tashmisho benachas. Let's ask the following two questions. Question number one: why is it that Shmuel feels compelled to introduce a principle here, to coin a new principle, when in truth Rav doesn't disagree with that principle? Rav also agrees that we apportion and dedicate the area to that which is tashmisho benachas, lazeh benachas, lazeh bekosher, nosino so lazeh shetashmisho benachas. Rav never denied that. Rav only argued that when we compare zrika and shilshul, we do not classify it or define it as zeh bekosher v'zeh benachas. Why? Because they're both in a difficult straits. They both need an extra effort to use this tail. Or alternatively, you could say, according to Rav, maybe there is a discrepancy. Maybe it's a little bit easier to throw something down than to throw something up. But that discrepancy doesn't warrant, it doesn't justify your conclusion that shilshul is benachas and relative to shilshul, zrika is bekosher. The increment here, the differential, is not so significant that we broaden this and make it zeh kosher, zeh nachas. But again, the point is that Rav fundamentally accepts this principle that kol tashmisho benachas so why does Shmuel coin this principle, coin this phrase? That's question number one. Question number two is a Tosfos here. Dibra Maschil Kosal Kedaitav. You'll see it on Pei Gimel and Beis, and it's the last Tosfos on the daf. And if you count up about 7, 8 lines from the bottom of Tosfos writes, "V'afal picha yordim ba min aliyos u'mishtamshim ba, eno oseres kevon disulam toras mechitza ola." Now, Tosfos is talking about a case where you have diurim, you have people living, residing in the aliyos on a very high level, so it's more than 10 tfachim above, from the aliyos, above the tail. In order for the Bnei Aliyos to have access to the tail, they have to go down a ladder. That ladder will lead them to the Merpeses, and from the Merpeses, they have comfortable access to the, to the tail. So Tosfos says that Sulam Toras Mechitza Olaf. Now it seems that what Tosfos has in mind here is that we don't view the sulam, even though again it makes it easy for, in the case of the Bnei Aliyos, to climb down and get access to this tail because they climb down from the Aliyah down to the Merpeses. We don't view it in terms of what's easy and what's noach. We view it in terms of a different child, and that is, how do we define a sulam? And the Gemara is going to have many discussions about this as we go through the perek, whether sulam is defined as a mechitza. If it's defined as a mechitza, then it's not defined as a pesach. And therefore, we're not going to have a situation where the Bnei Aliyos generate an iser on the Bnei Achotzer or the Bnei HaMerpeses, wherever they live, simply because the Bnei Aliyos have access by using a sulam. That sulam is not to be classified and defined as a pesach, but rather it's a mechitza. And that again goes according to one man diomer that identifies a sulam as a mechitza. So in a certain sense, since the sulam doesn't rate as a pesach, we don't consider it as if the Bnei Aliyah on the top level have immediate access and use of the amud or the tail, because the sulam is a mechitza. And that's good news for the Bnei Achotzer because they can use, and they have a head to tashmish as far as the amud or the tail is concerned, because there's no one else who's otzros zu al zu. And the question that we want to ask here on this Tosfos is, what difference to make whether the sulam is considered a mechitza or a pesach? How do you define it? It seems to be irrelevant. All that we have to determine is whether it's tashmish or benachas or not. And if the Bnei Aliyah can simply climb down this ladder and have access to the level below, even if it's 10 tefachim to go down, it's very easy access. And we should say, therefore, even despite the fact that the sulam is defined as a mechitza, nevertheless, we should be mavatal the rishus of the amud to the Bnei Aliyos, which again will generate an iser as far as the Bnei Hachotzer Lamata are concerned. And it's very interesting now because Tosfos is justifying the Gemara's kasha on Rav. Let's read the Gemara again. The Gemara says, after quoting this machlokas between Rav and Shmuel explained his reasoning based on the klal, as we call the kol davar shetashmichu lezeh benachas, v'lezeh bekoshen also no sol lezeh shebenachas. Tanan, we have a mission that says, Anshe Chotzer v'Anshe Merpeses sheshachachu v'lo erevu. So it means you have, let's call it 20 tfachim height to the Bnei Aliyah. You have 10 tfachim height to the Bnei Merpeses. And the Mishnah says, Kol shegavah asor tfachim Merpeses pachos mikan l'chotzer. Because salke daitoch, my Merpeses, Bnei Aliyah. The Gemara at this point, when it reads the Mishnah, thinks that Merpeset means a reference to the floor on top of the Merpeset. And my koile Merpeset, the Kasalki Merpeset, when they exit from their apartments on the Aliyah, they go down to the Merpeset, and that's how they get out of the building. And now Alma says the Gemara kol lazeb shilshul lazeb zrika no so lazeb shilshul. why does the Mishnah establish that we dedicate this amud or tail to the Bnei Haliyah? That's how we're interpreting it. If it's Gavah Sarah, after all, this is a case of Lazeh Bizrika, meaning, although it's true that the Bnei Achotz will have to throw it up, Lazeh Bizrika, but the Bnei Haliyah will throw it down. And the Gemara is now asking, well, this seems to prove Shmuel that we're going to dedicate this to those who are on top if it's above 10 tfachim. The Gemara is going to reject this interpretation immediately, but right now, and the reason why we're doing so is because Zrika is more difficult than Shilshul, so that the lower Chatzer has a need to be Zorek in order to get it onto the Amud or tail, whereas the Bnei Aliyah, who are more than 10 tfachim above this Amud, they have an easy match of Shilshul, and therefore we're going to dedicate this for the use of the Bnei Aliyah. And that's a proof to Shmuel, because Rav holds that Zrika and Shilshul are Shava b'Shava, they're equal. It's like Zela Pesach, Zela Pesach. We don't understand the Gemara's kasha over here. Why does the Gemara think that in this case, because of the 10 tfachim height of the Bnei Aliyah, it becomes a problem for Rav? After all, in terms of the use, what difference does it make once it hits 10 tfachim in height? In both cases, it's just a matter of shilshul, just lowering whatever you want to lower on top of the amud to use the amud. And again, we're seeing echoes of what Tosfos calls mechitza over here. Why should that make a difference? If we're talking about noach tashmicho, and we're trying to figure out whether it is noach tashmicho or not, or it's kosher, then it would seem that the 10 tfachim should be irrelevant. If it's shilshul and he can throw it down and that's comfortable, that should be enough. Let's add a statement here of the Ritva Afanort in the name of Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz. The Ritva writes, Afilu l'Rav shehu mashveh shilshul l'zrika, even though Rav says that shilshul and zrika are on the same level, that shaveh b'shaveh, kol sheyotza mitoras pesach l'shneim, lo shani lan ben koch echad lebeis kochos, the shilshul l'zrika dechad gisa, v'zrika de'idach gisa, shavim he. Says the Ritva in the name of Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz that this whole discussion here about Rav comparing shilshul to zrika, and he says it's shaveh b'shaveh, that's only when it's a case of yotza mitoras pesach l'shneim. Neither one, the mashalshel on top or the zorik on the bottom, has a pesach. And yotza mitoras pesach l'shneim, now Rav says we're not going to make any differences. We're not going to say that shilshul is more noach than zrika, and even in a case where you need shnei kochos, which means that you're going to have to throw it up and then it comes down, as opposed to someone who throws it up and it lands right away. He doesn't need a second koch. All those differentiations go down the, they go by the wayside. Why? Because we're lacking a Torah's Pesach. That's the phrase of the Ritva. It's quite clear from the Ritva that when Rav disagrees with Shmuel, it's not because he thinks that Shilshul and Zrika are Shaveh b'Shaveh in terms of Noach Tashmisha. There's no issue here. Well, how great of a distance is there? How wide of a gap is there between Shilshul and Zrika? But rather, Rav agrees to Shmuel that Shilshul is a lot easier than Zrika, and certainly in a case where Zrika requires 2 kochos, has to go up and then come down. But rather, says the Ritva in the name of Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz, that Rav disagrees fundamentally about the whole Geder, the way that the Chachamim enacted and defined its Rishus Shlishis. Shmuel holds that the issue of who will get use of the shliches is simply a matter of tashmish. Who has the easier tashmish? And Mamela, once it's easier for him, let's say the Mishalchel from on top, as opposed to the Zorik from the bottom, he's going to get Rishus to use it. Rav didn't understand it like that. Rav understood that the way that Chachamim made this takana was that the third Rishus becomes swallowed up, so to speak, by one of the other two Rishuyos. We're going to merge the third Rishus with one Rishus. According to Rav, Noach Tashmishto is not enough. You need what's called a mitzaref. What is that mitzaref? What is that agent that allows you to connect these two Rishuyos and make them into one, to unify them? The answer is a Pesach. And a Pesach means an opening that's less than 10 tefachim. Once the opening is more than 10 tefachim, it becomes a mechitza. And a mechitza is not a Pesach. And a mechitza prevents a tziruf between the Rishus Shliches and your Rishus when you want to unify and extend your Rishus to swallow up and envelop the third Rishus. You need an agent that's mitzaref, and you need a Pesach. If you don't have a Pesach, then the Ritva is saying in the name of Rabbeinu Peretz, Rav says that you don't get exclusive rights and a heter to use it. Not like Shmuel, who says, well, you get the exclusive rights and the heter to use it because it's Noach Tashmishto, you're in a superior position vis-a-vis the other chotzer. Then Rav needs a Pesach. Says the Ritva, if there's a 10 tefachim distance, which means it's not a Pesach, then Rav would say, I'm not going to shoot the dice here and figure out, evaluate, weigh which one of the two Chatzeros has more of a Noach Tashmisha. That's not going to be enough because I need a Pesach and I don't have a Pesach. I have the 10 tefachim of a Mechitza. And if that's the way Rav understood that in the case of a Rishus Shlishis that has to now become part of another Rishus, it's got to be swallowed up and we have to have a Mitzaref, and we need for that a Pesach, then we begin to understand why Tosfos says that a Sulam, if the only way that the Bnei Aliyah could get access to the Amud or the tail that's 10 tefachim below, is Sulam is a Mechitza. What does Tosfos mean when he says the Sulam is a Mechitza? What difference does it make, we asked? How this distance of 10 tefachim, what does it make it that much difference and more difficult when he does a shilchul? The answer is that's not enough. You need a mitzaref. And the mitzaref has to be the sulam. And the sulam cannot serve as a mitzaref is if we define it and classify it as a mechitza. And now, if that be the case, we begin to appreciate why Shmuel was the one who formulated this klal. And what he was doing with this klal is he was arguing against Rav. And he was saying in the klal, again, we'll read it once more, that kol shenoach lezeh v'lo lezeh, if it's more noach to one of them than the other, then, says Shmuel, it's designated for him as opposed to him. According to Shmuel, we don't have to create a mitzaref. We don't have to extend one rishus and have the rishus shlishis be swallowed up into the rishus. No, all we need is no tashmicho. No tashmicho itself is going to give you the heter. That's what Shmuel is coining in this principle. Rav never accepted that. Rav required a Pesach, and the Pesach serves as a mitzaref, and therefore Rav is going to tell you that even if it's more noach in the shilshul case, but if we don't have a Pesach because there's a 10 tefachim gap, that's considered a mechitza, or if we need a sulam in Tosfos' frame of reference, then there's no way of extending the rishus shlishis and have it swallowed up to the other rishus. There's no mitzaref, and that's what the Ritva means in the name of Tosfos Rabbeinu Peretz. Kol sheyotzim mitoras Pesach l'shneim lo shonilon. It doesn't matter whether it's koch echad, shnei kochos, whether it's noach b'shulshul as opposed to noach less noach and it's kosher in zrika. All that goes down the wayside, because all we care about now is whether or not we have a Torah's test. In effect, this chakira between Rav and Shmuel really is a chakira between Metzius and Din to some extent. Shmuel makes it all depend on Metzius, and therefore it's Memela that the one who has Noach Tashmisho better access is Mutter. Rav is looking for a halachic category, and that is a Torah's Pesach. Therefore, according to Rav, in the absence of a Torah's Pesach, there's no heter tachmish, even if it's Noach tachmish. And with this, we end our Siyum on Masechet Eruvin, Hajan Alecha Masechet Eruvin. I want to thank you all. A great yashikaya we put in, and great effort. Of course, we need a lot of chazara, but od chazon amoy. Shkoyach and mas.